everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books I read in the month of February. We have a lot of books to discuss today. I was on a reading spree in February, so we're not going to waste any time. We're going to hop right on into the books. So first I'll start by talking about some of the books that I did reading vlogs for this month. First off, I did an entire dedicated reading vlog to the book Anatomy, a Love Story by Dana Schwartz. I'm having a really good time with this book so far. I just feel like this is my aesthetic. The cobblestones and the horse carriages and the anatomy lectures and the organs and jars and the skulls and digging up the grave. This is a book that's a little hard to define. I talk about it in so much depth in that dedicated reading vlog. So if you really want to know everything there is to know about this book and if it'll be a good book for you, definitely check out that vlog because I do a breakdown of who I think it's good for and who it might not be so good for. But at its heart, this is a YA gothic coming of age story where you're following this young woman named Hazel who really wants to be a surgeon, but in the world she lives in, it is not acceptable for women to be surgeons. There's no support for that, and so she has a lot of trouble breaking her way into that world. She ends up making a deal with a professor that if she can pass the anatomy exam, then he will let her practice and become a surgeon. But because she's a woman, she's not allowed to attend the lectures, so she has a lot of trouble figuring out how to go about that until she meets this guy named Jack, and what he does for a living is dig up corpses and sell them to people who want to practice on them to learn their medical skills. So they end up making a really nice pair. It is a little bit of a love story between them as well, but really you're following Hazel and her journey to self-discovery and just really finding her path and her way to really pursue what she knows she wants to do in a world that is so against her. I really enjoyed this story. I think I ended up giving it 4 stars. It's not a book that's going to be for everyone. It is more of a slower paced character study type book. It's not full of action and plot, and it's not really a romance, even though it's called a love story. So I think it's one that you really just need to hear about before you can figure out if it's something that you're really going to enjoy or not. But it was something that checked all the boxes for me, and I really did enjoy this one. I also did another reading vlog this month for my TikTok Made Me Read It series, where I read 2 popular TikTok romances in the spirit of Valentine's Day. And so in that vlog, I read It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey and The Spanish Love Deception by Elena Armas. I'm really liking this. This is amazing and I love it. When they said slow burn, I didn't know this is what they meant. I'll flip the book this way so you can know what I'm talking about. I'm laying down. This is the state of things at the moment. I ended up with 1 success and 1 disaster. The Spanish Love Deception is an enemies to lovers, co-workers, travel romance type story where there are these 2 co-workers and the woman has to travel back to Spain for her sister's wedding. She needs a date because she told her family she has an American boyfriend to get them off her back about being single. And so her arch enemy at work, Aaron Blackford, volunteers to step up and be her fake boyfriends. There's also the fake dating trope. You spend a lot of time in the beginning of the book just building up the chemistry between them and things that go on in their normal world at the workplace and just other things going on in their life. And then they go to Spain for the wedding and you see what happens when they do that as well. And he meets her whole family and they have to really keep up the whole fake dating facade there. I like the idea of this book. It's got a lot of tropes that I can enjoy, but I didn't find this one to be the most enjoyable read because it is so very long. It's like 400 pages long. It is an incredibly slow burn. And while I typically like slow burn, this was a little bit too slow for me, but I have heard that there is an edited edition of this that is shorter. So I would definitely recommend trying out that one. Not like I've read it, but I imagine it would probably be a more enjoyable experience to edit out a lot of stuff that I feel like took up way too much time in this one. And then It Happened One Summer is a romance that is inspired by Alexis from Schitt's Creek. If you aren't familiar with that show, I think you can still enjoy this book, although I do think your enjoyment level is probably greater if you do have an attachment already to Alexis from Schitt's Creek as a character, because she's kind of an unlikable character at first, similar to how the character in this book is. The whole idea behind this book is the main female character is this woman named Piper who is like an influencer. She's very spoiled and she gets by on her stepdad's credit card. She's never really had to do anything for herself. She's never had to live in the real world per se, and she ends up partying a lot and gets on his last nerve, and he decides to send her to this small town in Washington that she actually has a lot of history with. It's where her biological father was from. Her biological father ended up dying a long time ago, and so he's sending her back to this small town because her biological dad owned a bar there, and that's a place that she can live, and it's a place where she's gonna have to just get by on her own and see how the other half lives. But the romance behind this story kicks off when she meets a fisherman in the town who seems to be the exact opposite of her. There's really no way they should end up together, but they end up complimenting each other really well and falling in love, and it's just a really cute little romance. It's very fun. It's a good summer read probably. I still enjoyed it reading in winter, but I definitely feel like it would be even better to read it like by the pool in the summer. It is also very smutty though, so that is something you need to know before going into this, because the second half of the book is like smut central, and if you are not here for very smutty sex scenes, then you're probably not gonna want to spend a lot of time in the second half of the book. I don't mind smut, but this was a little bit over the top for me, so I ended up giving it 4 stars, but I do still really enjoy it and I do still recommend it. Next up, I'll talk about a couple of books that I read for a 24-hour readathon that I did this month. I didn't vlog this, but I did end up doing reading sprints on my channel and my friend Hannah's channel because we did this readathon together. She did end up vlogging her experience though, so you can go check out her vlog if you want to see her half of the experience, but I just didn't have it in me to vlog this. I just wanted to chill and do reading sprints and hang out and read a lot, and I had so much fun and I got a good bit of reading done, so I ended up reading these 3 books during those 24-hour readathon sprints. The first one is Your Guide to Not Getting Murdered in a Quaint English Village by Maureen Johnson and Jay Cooper. This is a little book of comics that is exactly what it says. It's like a little handbook to how to not get murdered when you're going to visit a quaint little English village, and it's very satirical and very funny, and I was laughing the whole time that I was reading this. My cheeks hurt after I read it. I read it all in just one sprint in our first reading sprints that we did on my channel, so I read it all in 30 minutes. It's just got all these cute little funny comics in them about little tropes that you see often in these types of stories, and it was just a really good time. There's like inside jokes that go throughout the whole book, so like things about the vicar in the town will keep coming up throughout the story, and I don't know, it was just a really fun time. I gave it 5 stars. It did everything I was expecting it to do, and if you're also a fan of just short little comics that can make you laugh, this is definitely one that I would recommend. Next up, a very different type of book I read was Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. This is a horror novella that follows a woman who is grieving the loss of her son. She frequently visits the place where he died. He died in a car accident, and so she frequently will visit that spot. And one day she accidentally bleeds on the death site, and then she starts seeing her son's ghost. She's seen him before in dreams and stuff, but he seems even more real. Throughout the story, she essentially keeps going back and sacrificing things at his death site to solidify his ghost and make it more prevalent in her life so she can feel like she's getting her son back. This one is really heavy. There's a lot of trigger warnings for this one. It's not one I would say to go into lightly. This is definitely a very gruesome horror novella, but it was so effective for me, and I don't want to say I enjoyed reading this story, but I was just so engrossed with reading this story. I was having such visceral reactions to reading this book, and it's one that really haunts me and that I think about often. It feels almost like this was a movie I saw because I can see it playing back in my mind, and I think about this woman's journey and what happens over the course of this novella, and it's just so haunting. I absolutely love this. I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend this, and this is the first thing I've ever read from this author, or the first that I've ever heard of this author, so I'm definitely going to be checking out more of her backlist and future books to come, because this was a really, really solid novella. And then finally, during the 24-hour readathon, I read The Harpy by Megan Hunter. This is a book that's been on my radar for a long time, and I'm glad I finally picked it up. I knew vaguely what this book was about, and I knew it was going to be a weirder book, and I've seen that it has really terrible reviews. I'm pretty sure it's one of the lowest rated books that was on my TBR, but I've just been so intrigued by it for so long, and I'm really glad I finally read it. The idea behind this one is it follows this married couple. The woman discovers that her husband has cheated on her, and he is very apologetic when she finds out, and they come to a deal that she is allowed to hurt him 3 times in order to get back at him and restore their relationship so they can continue to move on. So he's like, fine, you can hurt me 3 times, and she's like, great, not gonna tell you how or when though. That's just the deal they come to. And so that's the story you're following throughout the course of this. It's only about 200 pages. It goes by really, really quickly, and it's told in vignette style writing. So it's just like short little sections, and it's a very poetic type prose. It's not a very straightforward story, and then it is a very ambiguous ending. So if you don't like ambiguous endings, wouldn't recommend this one to you because you will probably leave this feeling super unsatisfied, but this is just the kind of story that I really like. Sometimes I don't want a book that's gonna make me think. Sometimes I want things to be a little more handed to me on a silver platter, but other times I can really appreciate just a weird, slow, poetic book with a what the heck just happened ending that I just sit and ponder on. It kind of reminds me of like an A24 film film in that way. I feel like that's how I feel mostly about a lot of A24 movies, and I just really like the experience of watching those, and I really like the experience of reading this book. As soon as I finished, I was like, this could be anywhere between a 2 to 5 star. It could be a 2, a 3, a 4, or 5. I don't really know. And I still kind of feel that way with my rating. I don't really have a solid place to rate it because it's not really a straightforward book that I feel like I can just pin a rating on. But in my mind, it kind of exists as this like 4-star book. I definitely enjoyed it. I could have used a little more from it, and if the ending had been a little bit less ambiguous, I probably would have liked that too. But overall, I had a really enjoyable time with this. If you like really weird things, if you like ambiguous endings, and if you like really poetic writing in the vignette style, kind of similar to My Sister the Serial Killer, then I would recommend picking this one up. Next up, I'll talk about all of the thriller books that I read this month in absolutely no particular order. So first up, we have The Arrangement by Kirsten Moglen. This is a book that I've seen going around BookTube a lot recently. I feel like the first place I heard of it was from my friend Savannah from Riveting Reads, and I feel like she has influenced a lot of people to pick up Kirsten Moglen's stuff. I know she's read a couple of Kirsten Moglen's things. My friend Jessie from Reading with Jess has also read some Kirsten Moglen, and I know a lot of other people are starting to dip their toes in the waters, but Kirsten Moglen is this like incredible author who is an indie author who just started publishing a couple years ago and has like 20 to 30 books out right now. So she publishes like crazy, and I heard this book was just really mind-blowing and a really fun time, and so I figured this would be a good place to start with just seeing what Kirsten Moglen's writing is like. This is a pretty short little thriller story that is about this married couple, and they decide that to spice things up in their relationship, they're gonna start having an open relationship where the woman is gonna go on dates on Tuesdays and the man is gonna go on dates on Thursdays. But part of the rules of this arrangement is they're not allowed to talk to each other about the dates they're going on. They're not allowed to know who they're going on dates with or anything about it. It's just something they're doing to try to make the lust and want come back into their relationship, which I find to be a super fascinating story. I love thrillers where you're just following messy people or just like people doing unconventional things that you don't really see talked about a lot. Something like a married couple openly seeing other people is really interesting to me, just to see like the dynamics of how that plays out. It kind of reminds me of The Swap by Robin Harding, which is about these two couples that decide to swap partners, and I had a really good time with that thriller too. So I thought this one sounded like one that I would really enjoy, and I heard the ending was absolutely crazy, and that is absolutely true. I think this book was so much fun while I was reading it, and I was just really engrossed in the experience to see what would happen at the end. And I also think it's like the perfect length because it's only a little bit over 200 pages, so it's a really fast burn. Like you get through that thing and you're just engrossed in what's gonna happen in the relationship. I feel like it's not the fastest paced thriller. There's not really a lot happening until the ending, but because it's so short and because you know something crazy is coming, that's why I was so compelled to see like, oh no, where is this going to go for them? There's like 3 big reveals in this book, and the first reveal, I literally screamed when I read it. My boyfriend was sitting beside of me and I flipped the page and I read that and I was like, ah! And he was like, what are you doing? Are you good over there? And I was like, this book just completely shocked me. And so that was just so much fun to just feel shocked by a book again and just to fly through something and just get that experience that I'm really looking for out of a thriller. To be honest, the story's probably not one that's going to stick with me for a long time. I feel like it was more of an entertainment factor than something that I felt was like the best thriller I've ever read, but it was just a really fun time. So it's honestly probably like a 3-star if you put it on that kind of rating like I typically do with thrillers, but I'm gonna give it a 4-star because it made me scream and that was a really good experience. Next up, a not so good experience was The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkoff. I've heard this story pitched as being about this true crime writer who goes to this isolated cabin and gets snowed in. She's going there to work on her next book, and when she is snowed in the snowstorm, there is a child outside that she ends up inviting in, and then something crazy happens from there. That's all I really knew about this going in. That's what I was expecting, and it became something bigger than that in a way that I didn't really enjoy. I just checked the synopsis too to see if like maybe I just didn't read the synopsis and that's why I missed out on what happens. But the synopsis is also kind of misleading and makes it seem like the whole time you're just gonna be following this woman Wiley in this farmhouse in the middle of a snowstorm, and that's just really not the case with this. There are, I think, 3 different timelines and POVs throughout this book, so you get pulled out of the isolated cabin a lot and you get sent back into the past in the year 2000 when this gruesome murder ended up taking place at this farmhouse, and and so you're following, I guess, the story that the true crime writer is trying to write, but you're following it like just as you would with those characters anyway. And that really takes up a significant portion of the book, and it's a lot of just like following detectives trying to piece together what's going on, and that's just not my favorite style, especially because you don't really get to know the detectives. It's not like they play these big roles as these really well-rounded characters. They're just like detectives looking at the case, and the characters in that portion is more related to the family and what happened within the family. But you know, I don't know. It just wasn't what I was expecting. I really was looking forward to the creepy, snowy, isolated cabin feel of the story, but it really didn't end up being that creepy because you figure out what's going on with all the other things that are being pieced together. So it was just a little bit disappointing for me. It just wasn't what I was expecting. It was like a 2-star read for me. I just didn't really have a great time with it. But if you like stories like that with multiple timelines, multiple POVs, kind of piecing the story together in that way, then maybe you would end up liking this one more than I did. I just went in thinking it was going to be something completely different. Next up, an isolated story that did not disappoint me was These Silent Woods by Kimmy Cunningham Grant. I guess I did a mistake by lumping this in as the thrillers that I read this month, because this is not really a thriller, and I think that is what has gotten so many people disappointed in this book. Is it was marketed as a thriller. That's like one of the first genres you see come up when you look this book up, but really this is more of a literary suspense type story. In this story, you're following this man and his daughter who live in the middle of woods out in the middle of nowhere. When the story begins, you don't know why they're living there, but you have this feeling that the dad has been keeping them away from something. He has a lot of regret. It feels like there's something mysterious that happened in his past that has led to the circumstances of him and his daughter living this way now, where they literally don't go into town, they don't go into stores, they don't let anyone know that they are there. The only people who know that they are there is a friend of the dad's who comes once a year to bring them supplies and food in a very mass quantity, and the neighbor who lives kind of nearby, who is a little bit sketch, and he didn't really want that guy to know they live there, but he just keeps kind of coming around them a lot, and so he figured out that they live there, but it's very unclear if he can be trusted. The story begins when the guy who typically comes every year to bring them their supplies does not make it out there, and that forces the dad to have to go out for himself to go provide for him and his daughter. And then from there, the story just continues to escalate and unwind as their lives begin to change in a way that they didn't want. This is a really well-written book. This is a really beautiful story. It's got great atmosphere. The characters are so well written and believable as characters. I got so invested in them and their story. And the dad is definitely a morally ambiguous type character, so it just creates this level of complexity where you're rooting for them in a sense, but you're also skeptical of him at the same time. And I just thought it was really well done. I think the ending of this was like absolutely perfect. I don't think it could have been wrapped up in any better way. It was just a very satisfying ending. It was also an emotional ending. It did make me tear up a little bit, but overall I really did enjoy this book. I will say it is very slow because it is just like this literary suspense type story. There's not a lot of action happening with like twists and exciting reveals and oh no, things are going wrong and what are we gonna do now? Like it takes a while to get to that until the ending of the story. So I ended up giving this 4 stars. It wasn't a perfect 5-star for me because I do wish it would have been a little bit more exciting. There were points where I felt like we'd hit a lull in the story a little bit, but overall I still think it was really fantastically done. It's just important that you know this is not a thriller going into it, or else you will end up being severely disappointed. Next up, we have The Chalkman by CJ Tudor. I was really interested to pick this one up because I really enjoyed The Burning Girls by CJ Tudor in January, and that was the first book I'd ever read from CJ Tudor. And then I found out CJ Tudor has all these other books that I've just been sleeping on for years. I mistakenly thought The Chalkman and The Chestnut Man were the same book, and I knew what The Chestnut Man was about, and I didn't think that sounded like something I would like. And so I've just never even considered reading The Chalkman until I finally read The Burning Girls and looked into CJ Tudor's backlist. And I wanted to start with the first book that CJ Tudor ever published, also because I feel like I've heard pretty good things about this one in previous years. In this story, you're following this guy named Eddie in 2 different timelines. The first timeline is when he is a young boy living in a small town with his group of friends, and then the other timeline, he is a full-grown adult who is returning back to his hometown. When he was a young boy and he had all these friends in this small town, there were a lot of gruesome things that happened in their childhood. The reason this book is called The Chalk Man is because they would all draw these like chalk figures on the ground as ways to communicate with one another. So if they wanted to say like, hey, meet me at the park, they would draw in a certain color with certain symbols on the sidewalk to let their friends know like, oh, this is so-and-so giving you a secret message to meet me in the park. But then one day the messages that Eddie finds leads him out into the forest to find the dismembered body of a teenage girl. A lot of other crazy things happened during their childhood, but that was the main event that really sticks in Eddie's mind. And then in present day, he's all grown up. One day he receives a letter in the mail with a chalk figure. So he decides to go back to the town, and then it begins to cause this unraveling of understanding what happened during his childhood and how that's connected to things that are happening in the present day as well when one of his friends ends up dead. I was really surprised to find that this book was very reminiscent of Stephen King's writing, at least the books that I've read from Stephen King. This very much felt like reading a Stephen King story where you're following this male character who's like reflecting on his boyhood and saying all these ominous statements about childhood and being happy and what happened. Also, just the setup felt pretty similar to It when I was reading it, because you're following this group of kids in the town, and there's even like a redheaded girl who's a part of their friend group who is clearly living in an abusive home. So it was very reminiscent of It and just generally Stephen King at times, which to be honest is not my absolute favorite style. So that wasn't my absolute favorite thing, but I do think overall this was a pretty good book. It's a pretty solid thriller. I really like CJ Tudor's style in general, how it sort of borders on the lines of horror. There's just these horrifying elements, or it gets really gruesome. It's not afraid to be graphic and dark and make that really interesting and explore these psychological elements as well. And I feel like CJ Tudor just does a nice job of having enough things going on that you're following the story, but a little bit confused and not guessing the twists that are going to happen, which is really nice as well, because I like to be surprised in thrillers. So overall, I think I ended up giving this like a 3.5 star. It wasn't my favorite thriller I've ever read. It wasn't my least favorite thriller I've ever read. I thought it was a pretty good time. It's definitely one I would recommend. But so far from what I've read from CJ Tudor, this is definitely not my favorite book of hers. The Burning Girls still is my favorite one, but I'm excited to read more of CJ Tudor's stuff and see if I enjoy all of her books and get excited about what's coming from her next. And then finally, the last thriller that I read this month was The Golden Couple by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. This was my book of the month choice for the month. And honestly, I did not have the highest of hopes for this because I know people don't feel the greatest about this author duo and their books. The only book that I've read from them in the past was An Anonymous Girl, and that ended up being like a 3.5 star read for me. I thought it was okay, but there were definitely things that I didn't like about that book and the writing style in general. So I was going into this one a little bit skeptical and just anticipating that it might not be my new favorite thing. And that is exactly how I ended up feeling about this book. It's a story about this couple who seems like the golden couple. They seem like they've got it all together. They live this luxurious life. But one day they come to this therapist whose name is Avery, and Avery is not your typical therapist. She has lost her license, but she is still practicing just on her own. And she has some really unconventional methods. The way she does therapy is she says she can fix any problem in 10 sessions, and each session has its own theme of the way she takes you through therapy. And it's just this weird, mysterious thing. So this couple that seems like they've got it all together comes to Avery for this really unconventional therapy, and then you start unraveling what's really going on in their marriage, what's going on with this therapist, and just finding out a lot of secrets throughout the story. I think my overall statement about this book would be that it was fine. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It was just fine. It just wasn't super exciting. It was pretty slow paced. It took a really long time to start getting reveals, and by the time we did, they weren't that exciting to me for the most part. I honestly can't even remember much about the ending at this point, and I just read it less than 2 weeks ago, and it's already kind of slipped from my mind, so it's not one that really sticks with me. I'm not like super mad that I read it. I don't feel like I wasted my time per se. It's just one of those thrillers that I read and then I kind of forget about, and it was an okay experience reading it, but it's not a book that I'm like pushing down everyone's throats and saying, oh my gosh, you have to read this book. But it's also not a book that I'm saying is so terrible and oh my gosh, maybe you shouldn't read this book. I feel like right in the middle about it. So if it seems like something that would be interesting to you, or if you've had success with this author duo in the past, then I'd say it's worth picking it up. If you have absolutely no interest in it, I don't think you're really going to be missing out on much if you don't pick it up. And then finally, we have my 2 books that I do for my 2 challenges that I do every month. At least I'm trying to do them every month this year. The first challenge is I want to read a backlist book every single month for the Buzzwordathon prompt that Kayla from Books and Lala does throughout the year. So in February, the prompt was to read a book with pronouns in the title. And so the backlist book that I chose for that was You Have Me at Hola by Alexis Daria. And unfortunately, I ended up DNFing this book 100 pages in. I still am counting this for the challenge though, because at least least I tried. But by the time I got around to picking this book up, I really lost all interest I had in it from when I bought it in like 2020 when it was getting a lot of buzz. I've just heard so many bland reviews about it that I just wasn't excited to pick it up anymore. But I really only had like 2 books with pronouns in the title on my TBR, and the other one had even worse ratings. So I decided to go with this one. It is this romance story about these actors on a telenovela. The woman character is just going through this really big breakup with the guy she was dating, and she's getting a lot of coverage from paparazzi about being dumped. So she's really concerned about her image right now. She doesn't want to be seen as this dumped lady on the magazines. She wants to be seen as a leading lady. And in her mind, leading ladies don't end up on magazines unless it's for something positive. And then the main guy in this story was just killed off of the last show that he was on. And he's a little bit worried for his career too, because he was killed off of that show and he feels like that's not a good sign. So they're both in these tumultuous areas of their careers and they're coming together on this show and they really want to make it work. They want to have like great chemistry. They really want it to be a success to really revitalize their careers. This was a totally fine romance, at least for the first 100 pages. I for sure could have kept reading it and could have gotten through it, but I just didn't feel like it was really going to do much for me. There wasn't really anything super interesting that hooked me into the romance. I feel like I typically gravitate towards romances when there's like an enemies to lovers or forced proximity or fake dating. I like the really tropey romance stuff, and this just wasn't super tropey. It was just 2 people coming together and they were obviously going to fall in love, and that was really it. I'm sure there's probably some more complexity that comes along the plot further throughout the story. There is this thing the guy is hiding, and I'm sure that was probably going to end up being a big part of the story as well, but I just wasn't super intrigued, and I didn't want to force myself to read it just for the sake of reading it if I wasn't really enjoying it. So that's how I ended up feeling about this one. And then my other monthly challenge that I do is I'm trying to read 1 nonfiction book each month, and so this month the one that I chose was the Collected Schizophrenias, which is an essay collection by Esme Wei-hun Wong. This is an essay collection following this woman's journey with mental health illnesses and her diagnosis journey and just living with a mental illness and how she goes about in life, and really examines a lot about just the mental health care system and how we diagnose mental illnesses and how we treat them and how society views mental illness. And if you know me, you know that I really, really love reading about mental health, whether that's fiction, nonfiction, memoir style, essay. I'm really fascinated by just learning more about mental health, but I was having trouble reading this one, and as you can probably see by the bookmark in it, I ended up DNFing it after the first like 3 essays in this story. It is pretty short, but even then it was just a little hard going for me, and I didn't want to force myself to read it just for the sake of trying to complete this challenge. I might come back to this book again soon or later in life, I'm not really sure, but it is just essay collections, so I could just like gradually read them as I find the motivation to. But this writing style just didn't really click for me. It was very clinical and wordy and just like a higher reading level type writing style, I guess. So I was having a little bit of trouble just connecting with the writing style. It's also essay collections, but within each essay, there's kind of like vignettes that you're following as well. So I didn't feel like I was really following this narrative story of this woman's life, which is what I find easiest to consume. So I ended up DNFing this one for now, but from what I've read from it so far, I do think the content is interesting. It's just hard for me to parse through to get what I want to get out of it. There's definitely some really fascinating topics that have been talked about so far, just in terms of how we diagnose mental illnesses and how there's still so much unknown about mental illnesses. And she talks about how there's different editions of the DSM that comes out, and as those editions change, your diagnosis may change too, because something like schizophrenia is just defined by a clustering of symptoms, and if that clustering changes or if your symptoms change, just like how ambiguous and unknown it all still is, which I do think is really fascinating to just get to hear about. She also talks about the idea of being high functioning, which is just such an interesting concept. There's just so much in this book that I would love to be able to unpack, but I think I need something like a level down from this as an introduction to a lot of these concepts before I could return to this book and feel like I'm really fully getting at everything I want to get at. So the book that I'm going to be picking up as a starter to warming me up into this book is a book that was referenced in this one, and it's called The Center Cannot Hold: My Journey Through Madness by Ellen R. Sachs. This is a memoir from Ellen Sachs, who is a professor at the University of Southern California School of Law, who was diagnosed as schizophrenic and was given a grave prognosis and has dealt with a lot of paranoia in her life. And she just talks about that whole journey throughout that, spending time in a psychiatric ward, how she moves through life every day. And so I feel like that'll be a good introductory book maybe to read before I return back to this one, just to help me understand some of the concepts that are discussed in this book a little better and to be able to dig through a lot of the writing in this one. But like I said, I'm super fascinated in this topic. So if anyone has any other related book recommendations, really just anything nonfiction pertaining to mental health, that is one of my favorite subgenres to read about. So let me know if you have any recommendations down in the comments below. So that is it for all of the books that I read in the month of February. If I had to pick my standout favorites for the month, it would be a little bit difficult because I feel like I had a pretty solid reading month. There wasn't really a lot that I hated or felt really annoyed by spending my time on. I pretty much at least enjoyed most of what I read during the month. So if I had to pick some favorites, I would pick Crossroads by Laurel Hightower for my horror recommendation, It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey for my romance recommendation, and The Arrangement by Kirsten Moglin for my thriller recommendation. Let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of these books and what you think about them, or just let me know what you read in the month of February and what your standout favorites were for the month. If you made it to the end of the video and you want to leave an emoji in the comments to let me know that you made it to the end, or if you just don't know what else to comment, let's do the 2 hearts emoji because that is my favorite style of heart emoji, and it was the month of Valentine's Day, a month of love, so we'll just do some hearts this month. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye!